Let us pray. Eternal One, you have given your scriptures to us in order that we might be encouraged to see a better way of living. Today, as we open our hearts to these words, help us to choose life, help us to choose the way of God, help us to follow the steps of Jesus in all that we do. Amen. Sometimes one of the ways I approach a passage after over 30 years of doing sermons is I like to have a look and then say, how do I feel when I've read this passage? I read this short passage and there was one word that came to me. I squirmed. It's an interesting word. Do you know what the word squirm is? Is that a particularly English sort of word, or do you Australians and people from other places use the word squirm? Squirmish? What does squirmish mean? Yeah, you know, to squirm. Yeah, it's got that sort of like feeling, hasn't it? You know, the best way I can describe a squirm, because I think we've all experienced what it is like to squirm, is when you sit down at a table and you have got someone who is so clearly out of touch with the rest of the table, and you know that person is going to say something that's going to become somewhat irksome. And it always happens at family turns. I find them the best because you always know someone is going to say something totally inappropriate. And you know it's going to come. It's just a matter of when it comes. Yeah? Yeah, you know that. And then you feel, oh, no, don't say that. Please don't do that. No. And everyone feels the discomfort in the room. That's how I felt when I read today's passage, for a number of reasons. And the first and the most obvious reason is the one of people who want to be social climbers around the table. It is interesting that even to this day, we tend to normally invite the people we feel most comfortable around the meal table with us, the people we like to be with. Occasionally that does get transcended and we do invite family as well, but normally we eat with the people that we like, don't we? 9 times out of 10, it's about that. I usually have my meals on my own, so I don't know what that says about me, but I'll let you judge that. But when you get to this point and people are sitting around a table, especially a special table where people have been specially invited, you see people manoeuvre around. Many years ago, Greg, I think, might have been even at this occurrence, but I was invited to meet the then leader of one of the political parties and invited to have an afternoon dinner / lunch with that person. It was Robert Doyle, who is now the mayor, the Liberal Party, and it was really interesting to see how people sat and how they went. I actually was in my full biker time of life, so you know my normal dress was motorcycle things, motorcycle jacket, black jeans and black t-shirt. It was a wonderful life because you never had to think about what you wore in the day. You knew exactly what it was. But because I was meeting someone special, I decided to wear a suit. And I had a very nice suit on. I think it was nice. It looked nice to me when I put it on. But and he was most disappointed because I didn't wear all my bike gear. He wanted to see me in my bike gear rather than that. But I watched as people manoeuvred around the table to try to be with him and speak to him. And one person in particular whose sole bent is they wanted to become a politician. They were actually a councillor at the time, but they had greater aspirations. And to see them move around the table to try and sit round next to Robert Doyle was cringeworthy. It was really sort of, like that. So I sort of started to think of that in terms of this, you know, how people are social climbers. They love to sort of get on the right side and sort of buddy up to someone to get their own way. For what reason? So that they could make the world a better place? No, purely to enhance their own social position in life. And that's what Jesus is warning us about here. But I was also worried about Jesus himself. And I have to say this because I want to be true to the scriptures, because I believe they need to be dealt with a bit of truth. What a sort of guest is he? He's come along to this Pharisee's place, this religious teacher's place as a guest, and he gets up and starts to perform and starts to tell people off and starts to tell parables about them. What sort of guest is this? Would you feel comfortable with someone like that? If you invited the local preacher and then the local preacher's sitting around the table and then gets up and decides to tell everyone how they should live and who they should live with and what they should do with their lives, I would feel particularly slighted, especially knowing that the customs of this time was the person that was supposed to facilitate all of this was the host rather than the guest. And the guest actually starts to take over the role of the host, which is ironic when you consider what Jesus is saying to those who are seeking places of honour. As Jesus seeks to become the main central part of this conversation. And so I have to say I squirmed at that a second time, because I don't like people coming into my house and then starting to sprout their ways and tell people how they should live, except for my wife, of course. I want to feel like I'm the king of my own domain. This is my place. Who are you to come in and tell me how I should do it? But apparently Jesus is not a person that is taken by the rules and rigours of our social niceties. In fact, if we can't be offended by Jesus, I don't know who we can be offended by, because Jesus' words are so often difficult and even offensive for us to deal with. And we might like the vision of a gentle Jesus, meek and mild, but that is not the vision of the Jesus we have today, is it? We have a forthright, outspoken Jesus, which probably wouldn't fit too well into the majority of our churches at this very moment. Someone who sees it and tells it like it is. That also took me back to this very same luncheon that I had with Robert Dorr, because around that table we had one of the local journos. His name was Mike. He wrote for the local paper, but he had been one of these journalists that had been around since Adam was a boy. You know, hard-bitten, looked as though he'd smoked too many cigarettes and had one too many bottles of wine along the way in life. But a very good, honest, down-to-earth journalist. Someone who wrote as they saw it, without fear or favour, and would often write very critical comments about particular people in politics around us, often about people who were pretenders to some kind of power. And I did actually sit down and talk to him, because I'd been a couple of times on the more poison side of his pen, because I used to have a slightly higher profile then than I do now. And we were talking about it, and he says, you know what, Paul, my job is to afflict the comforted and to comfort the afflicted. And that's the way I often see Jesus. And I'm not saying that Mike was anything like Jesus, but the purpose to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comforted. Because if we really want to look at Jesus, he is acting to type. Right in the beginning of this gospel, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, if you look to the story of Jesus coming to the temple, as he was born, there was a man called Simeon who had waited a lifetime to see Jesus. And when he saw Jesus proclaim these words, he will be the rising of many and the fall of many. And that's exactly what is happening here. People who wish to be social climbers, who wish for places of importance, who seek about self, are brought down. And those who are the nobodies are lifted up. In fact, Jesus challenges the very boundaries of our lives. In this story, he challenges who sits round the table. Before, he challenged the Sabbath. Do you remember about the healings on the Sabbath? And the people were trying to say, you shouldn't do that. And Jesus' response is, well, you know, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And tried to say, hey, this is about more than just rules. Jesus constantly would go beyond the boundaries. And as we go through this chapter and into next chapter, as we read stories that we will become oh so familiar with, stories like the Good Samaritan, stories of the widow who lost many things, and the story of the prodigal son, which will come in the next chapter, in chapter 15, we can see that the politic of Jesus, not the politics, but the politic of Jesus, is one that challenges the very boundaries of each of our lives. And as I'd said before, if you can't be offended by Jesus, Jesus must be doing something wrong, or the construct we have of Jesus may be the wrong view. Because Jesus is not just the baby in the manger, but the man who challenges the very status quo that stops people experiencing the love of God. Later in the stories, we will find that Jesus talks another time about a banquet where the rich and the famous are invited. But for many reasons, they decide, we can't come today. I've got to go and bury my father. I've got to go and do my business. I've got to go and do this. And then he says, we will go into the highways and byways, and we will invite basically the very least people to come and be part of this great banquet, referring to another time in another space where things will be different, where those who have been put down will be lifted up, and those who are lifted up will then be suddenly brought down to themselves. I thought about this in light of the Olympics. We watched the Olympics last week. We said that it's all over. But I've been following a story of that swimmer, you know, the American swimmer who came out and said he was robbed. And it turned out that he wasn't. And it made me start to think how much, even to this day, does fame and does profile corrupt who we actually are. You know, he was interviewed this week and he said, you know, basically, you know, in retrospect, you know, I might be a bit more forthcoming. You know, basically he should have said, look, I told a lie, I'm sorry. You know, we live in a world of spin, and I look at the values that we currently have in this community, where footy players are paid astronomical amounts of money, and yet people like paramedics, like nurses, people who bring value to life are not paid very well at all. And I say, what a crazy world we live in. Whereas a skill to kick a footy around isn't really sort of that great, and yet gets promoted beyond what it should be. And I don't care whether you barrack for Hawthorn like I do, or Collingwood like Marion does, or whoever you barrack for. Footy players have simply played way too much for what they bring to our community. I've dealt a lot with high-profile sportsmen in the past, and I think it's obscene, the amounts of money that people get, because it's not just their salaries. I was with a basketball club, and I can remember being with the then best player, and he got his bonuses. And we were sitting at his house when the man came from the board to bring the bonus, and he just put stacks of $100 bills onto the table in front of him. My wife said, could you take them away? We don't see that sort of money in a year, let alone in a week. And it just made me think, you know, what a crazy society we're in. And no matter how the AFL or whichever code likes to promote themselves as being the good people, I will make a prophecy that a footy player in a very short period of time will do something wrong, morally, and indecently in our community. And I think I will be pretty safe on saying that sort of stuff. Why? Because we build people up, not for the right credentials, but for the wrong credentials. The story that Jesus is telling us today is about, one, a self-awareness of knowing who we are. Surely just being in the room with Jesus at this point is enough in itself, rather than getting the places of honour. And so, my friends, today, I think there's some squirm-worthy factors in each of our lives that we need to examine, and we need to let Jesus speak forthrightly into. It's not my job to tell you as individuals where those areas are, but it is my job to bring the challenge that Jesus brings to each one of us every week. I pray that we are brave enough to accept the challenge before us, to hear what Jesus says in our lives here and today. Amen.